So we had an average of, well, we had 14 newsrooms, sorry, 9 newsrooms. We had about 14 journalists working on stories. As I mentioned earlier, they were in French, Portuguese, English. So we worked with a number of, we had to work with a number of language editors as well as the prosecutorial and the economic editors. One of the big successes certainly is the fact that we managed to cater across a continent. Sort of, I think we forget that, you know, it's not the same. It's not, every country has its own limitations, has its own expectations, has its own laws that govern freedom of the press, and that we managed to kind of publish in 9 different countries, I think, across Africa in various different languages. So one of the successes that is also definitely mentionable is the fact that the AU picked up on the Panama Papers and also has issued warnings to a number of governments demanding that they investigate names that have been released, names and companies that have been released.
And I guess Khadija would want me to say this, but the big weapon in the ANCIR arsenal is the prosecutorial editing. So the fact that you can, a story can not be redactively looked at by lawyers, but actually positively looked at by our prosecutorial expert, Heinrich, and you know, kind of really panel beat it so that it's checked for corroboration, consistency, bias, and that basically it's prepared for if you ever get sued as a journalist or as a media organization, you've basically already got all your answers in place for you know, for any legal issues that might come down the road. Let's talk a bit more about some of the more interesting curveball issues that we encountered while working on this, and you know, maybe you can speak a bit more to these. But I guess one of them is that, unlike in North America, some journalists in some of the territories we worked in have to be paid to do these stories because their newsrooms don't actually give them the resources to be able to work on them. So, you know, a lot of them had to do these stories in their spare time because their newsrooms are so under-resourced, and this is true in South Africa as well, so under-resourced that you actually can't afford to get a journalist working on a story for, I mean, we could call it a year in this case. So we had to pay some journalists, and I think that's well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's pretty different to some of the European and North American experiences. Khadija, do you want to maybe speak to some of the successes and some of the issues around it?
I think it was a very successful initiative, as Amanda and Chris mentioned, because it showed a level of trust and networking in terms of a transnational investigation that ordinarily would have been very difficult to keep under wraps. So there was that level of teamwork and of integrity in the process. And as the journalists needed to start interviewing the companies and the governments, we were able to encourage them, and they themselves proposed using the leak as a lead and finding public or alluvial information, maybe other stories that had already been done, insider information, to try and raise it from a different angle without necessarily exposing that it was the leak that was causing them to approach the story. So I thought that was a very ingenious way of African media beginning to dig and mine into the story without exposing the source.
And I know you're very conscious of the fact that so many people worked on these stories, and that you know, we really should be giving credit to a lot of people who aren't on this webinar, and who are dotted all around Africa. So maybe you want to give us just one or two of what you consider to be the top stories with kind of really impactful outcomes.
We had several countries that didn't have media partners, for example, in Sierra Leone, Angola, Guinea, and in those cases, we did the stories in-house working with very talented investigative reporters or researchers in countries like Tunisia. So the entire continent has different political regimes in place, different strengths and weaknesses. And in countries like Tunisia, we found that the journalists were under severe harassment, threat, and intimidation, which was quite different to a country like Namibia or Botswana, where the stories would be picked up and proposed in the public interest, and that the media would be a vehicle for people to actually engage with their governments, which was very different from the North African regimes. So it is interesting to see the different political economies and the different types of threats that emerged in this type of situation.